The candles had barely been lit when Alina Whitmore heard her own name turned into a joke. She was standing near the long table in the Ashford dining hall, her gloved hands folded in front of her, when Lord Reginald Ashford raised his glass toward the 20 guests seated around him and said, loud enough for every corner of the room to hear, that he had finally found a woman plain enough to keep his secrets and quiet enough to never argue with him. Laughter rolled across the table like a wave. Someone clapped. A woman in a green gown pressed a napkin to her mouth to hide her smile. Alina did not move. She had walked into that house only 20 minutes earlier, believing she had been invited as a guest of honor, not as a punishline for a man who collected humiliations the way other men collected watches. She had worn her best dress, a simple blue one with no lace and no jewels, because that was all she owned that was clean and pressed. She had practiced a polite smile in the mirror before she left her small rented room above the bakery on Milk Street. She had told herself that tonight might be the night her quiet, careful life finally changed. It was about to change, just not in the way she had imagined. Lord Ashford lowered his glass and looked at her, the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he is deciding whether to keep. His eyes were pale gray, sharp as broken glass, and his mouth wore the same half-smile it always wore when he was about to say something cruel and call it honesty. He was 30 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of handsome face that made people forgive him things they should never have forgiven. His family owned half the land between the river and the eastern hills. His name opened doors that stayed locked for everyone else in the county. And he had just called her plain at his own table, in front of everyone who mattered in that town. The silence that followed the laughter was worse than the laughter itself. Alina felt every eye in the room turn toward her, waiting to see if she would cry, or flush red, or run from the room the way the last woman he had insulted at a dinner party had done, 6 months earlier, according to the stories people still whispered about at church. She did not cry. She felt something rise inside her chest that was not embarrassment at all. It was something older and steadier, something her father had planted in her many years ago, back when she was a small girl sitting on his knee in a cottage with a leaking roof, listening to him tell her stories about patience and timing and the exact moment when a quiet person finally decides to speak. Her father had always told her that the loudest man in the room is rarely the most powerful one. He said real power was quiet. It waited, it watched. It never needed to raise its voice because when it finally moved, everyone else went still. Alina thought of him now, sitting in his chair by the window back home. His hands folded the same way hers were folded now, and she felt her spine straighten without her telling it to. She smiled. It was not a small smile, not a shy or embarrassed twitch of the lips. It was slow and complete, the kind of smile that made the woman in the green gown stop laughing and glance nervously at the man beside her. It was a smile that did not belong on the face of a woman who had just been humiliated. It belonged on the face of someone who knew something the rest of the room did not. Lord Ashford noticed the shift immediately. He had spent his whole life reading rooms, reading faces, knowing exactly how far he could push people before they broke. It was a skill his father had taught him, the same way other fathers teach their sons to ride a horse or shoot a rifle. And right now, every instinct he had ever trained was telling him that something was wrong. The woman in front of him should have been trembling. Instead, she looked calm, almost amused, as if she had been expecting this exact moment for a very long time. "You find something funny, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, his voice still carrying that same lazy cruelty, though there was a new edge underneath it now, something careful and uncertain. "I find it interesting," Alina said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room the way a single bell carries across a still field. That a man with your name would choose to insult a guest at his own table, in front of people whose opinions he claims to value so much. A few of the guests shifted in their seats. The woman in the green gown lowered her napkin. "Insult?" Lord Ashford let out a short laugh, though it did not sound quite as confident as it had a moment ago. "I merely stated a fact." "Then let me state one in return," Alina said, and she rose from her seat. She did not rush. She smoothed the front of her simple blue dress with both hands, unhurried, the way a woman does when she has all the time in the world and knows it. Then she stepped back from the table, just far enough to give herself room, and she curtsied. It was not the quick, embarrassed curtsy of a servant leaving a room. It was slow, deep, and precise, the kind of curtsy taught only in the finest houses to daughters who were expected to one day stand before kings. Her back was straight, her chin lifted just enough to show respect without showing weakness, her eyes never once leaving Lord Ashford's face. It was the kind of curtsy that belonged to old blood and older money, the kind that made two of the older women at the table sit up a little straighter, as if some long-buried instinct in them recognized what they were seeing before their minds caught up to it. The room had gone completely silent. Even the servants standing near the walls had stopped moving. "Thank you, Lord Ashford," Alina said, her voice still calm, still quiet, but carrying now with a weight it had not carried before. "For your honesty. It is a rare thing at a table like this one. I only wish I had known sooner what kind of man I was agreeing to dine with tonight." Lord Ashford's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you mean to accomplish with theatrics, Miss Whitmore, but—" "My name," Alina interrupted, and something in the way she said it made him stop, "is not entirely Whitmore. It is the name my father chose to use when he left his old life behind, many years before I was born. It was never the name he was born with." A murmur moved through the table like wind through dry grass. "He gave it to me because he wanted me to grow up without the weight of what came before," Alina continued. "He wanted me to learn kindness before I learned power, patience before I learned pride. He raised me above a bakery, in 2 small rooms, and he taught me to sew my own dresses and bake my own bread, and he never once told me who he truly was, until I was old enough to understand why it mattered." "And who," Lord Ashford said slowly, his voice quieter now, almost careful, "was your father?" Alina held his gaze for a long moment. She could see the exact instant something behind his eyes shifted from irritation to something closer to fear, though he was trying very hard not to let it show. "You will learn that soon enough," she said. "By morning, I imagine, if the servants in this house talk as much as I have heard they do." She turned then, without waiting for his reply, and began walking toward the door. Her steps were unhurried, measured, the same calm pace she had used to rise from her chair. Behind her she heard chairs creak as guests turned to watch her go, heard the faint rustle of whispered questions passing from one end of the table to the other, heard Lord Ashford's voice call her name once, sharply, the way a man calls out when he realizes too late that he has made a mistake he cannot take back. Alina did not turn around. She reached the tall wooden doors of the dining hall and paused only long enough to glance back over her shoulder. One final look at the room full of people who had laughed at her 10 minutes earlier and now sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether to be embarrassed for themselves or afraid of what was coming. "Good evening," she said simply, and then she was gone, out into the cold night air, down the wide stone steps of the Ashford estate, toward the carriage that was waiting for her at the edge of the drive, exactly where she had arranged for it to be, exactly on time. The driver, an older man named Oliver Grant who had worked for her father for over 20 years, opened the carriage door without a word and helped her inside. He had been waiting nearby the entire evening, watching the windows of the dining hall, ready to leave the moment she gave the signal. He had known, better than anyone, that tonight was never truly about dinner. "Well," he asked once the carriage began to move, the wheels crunching softly over the gravel drive. Alina let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and for just a moment, the calm, composed woman who had curtsied in front of 30 strangers allowed herself to sag against the carriage seat, her hands trembling slightly now that no one could see them. "He called me plain," she said quietly, staring out the small window at the estate growing smaller behind them, its windows glowing gold against the dark hillside. "At his own table. In front of everyone." Oliver's weathered face creased into something that was almost a smile. "And what did you do?" "I thanked him," Alina said, "for his honesty." Oliver chuckled softly, a low sound that carried years of loyalty and quiet pride in it. "Your father would have been proud of that." Alina turned from the window and looked at him, and for the first time since she had stepped into that dining hall, something like uncertainty crossed her face. "Do you think he suspects who I am? Truly?" "I think," Oliver said carefully, guiding the horses onto the main road that would carry them back toward the city, "that by morning Lord Ashford will know exactly who your father is. And I think he will spend a very long time wishing he had chosen his words more carefully tonight." Alina said nothing for a while. The carriage rocked gently beneath her, the sound of the horses' hooves steady and familiar against the packed dirt road, and she let her mind drift back to the small cottage above the bakery where she had grown up, to the quiet man who had raised her there, to the years of lessons disguised as bedtime stories, the careful lectures about grace and timing that she had never fully understood until tonight. Her father had always told her that one day she would need everything he had taught her. She had not believed him, not really, not until she received the invitation to Lord Ashford's dinner 3 weeks earlier and watched her father's face change the moment he read the name on the card. He had gone very still. Then he had asked her, in a voice she barely recognized, whether she was certain she wanted to accept. She had said yes, because she did not yet understand what she was agreeing to. Now, riding away from the estate in the dark, the cold night air slipping through the carriage window, Alina finally understood. This dinner had never been an accident. It had never been a simple invitation from a wealthy man curious about a quiet woman in town. It had been a thread pulled loose from a much older story, one that had begun long before she was born, in a scandal that had ruined one family and forced another into hiding. Tonight, without meaning to, Lord Reginald Ashford had pulled that thread all the way to its end. "Where to now?" Oliver asked, glancing back at her through the small window that connected the driver's seat to the carriage. Alina straightened her spine, the same way she had straightened it at the table, and looked forward, toward the dark road ahead, toward the city lights just beginning to glow on the horizon. "Home," she said, "for now. There is someone I need to speak with before the sun rises." The carriage rolled on into the night, carrying her away from the table where she had been humiliated, back toward the small rooms above the bakery, back toward the man who had spent her entire life preparing her for exactly this moment, though neither of them had known it would arrive so soon, or with such little warning. Behind them, in the great dining hall of the Ashford estate, Lord Reginald Ashford remained standing at the head of his table, staring at the closed doors through which Alina Whitmore had just disappeared, while 30 of the most powerful people in the county whispered his name and hers in the same breath, and not one of them, including Reginald himself, understood yet just how much had changed in the span of 10 short minutes. But by morning they would. By morning everyone would. The lamp in the window was still lit when the carriage finally reached the narrow street above the bakery, and Alina felt her chest tighten at the sight of it. Her father never went to bed before she returned home, no matter how late the hour, and tonight he would be waiting with questions she was not entirely sure how to answer. She climbed the narrow wooden stairs slowly, her legs heavier than they had been all evening, the weight of everything that had happened finally settling over her now that the danger of the dining hall was behind her. When she opened the door, she found her father exactly where she expected him to be, seated in his worn chair by the window, a single candle burning on the table beside him, a book open on his lap that he had clearly not been reading. Edmund Hale looked up the moment she entered, and whatever composed expression he had been holding onto broke instantly into something closer to fear. "Tell me," he said, setting the book aside and rising from his chair with more speed than a man his age should have been able to manage. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Alina removed her gloves slowly, buying herself a moment to gather her thoughts, though in truth she had been replaying the evening over and over in her mind the entire ride home, and knew exactly what she wanted to say. "He called me plain," she said, "at his own table in front of 30 guests, as though I were nothing more than a joke he had prepared in advance." Her father's hands curled into fists at his sides, and for the first time in her life, Alina saw something in his face that frightened her a little, an old anger surfacing from somewhere deep and long buried. "And what did you do?" he asked, his voice tight. "I curtsied," Alina said. "The way you taught me. The proper way, the way you said only truly great houses still teach their daughters. And then I told him my name was not entirely Whitmore." Her father went very still. "I did not give him the rest," she added quickly, watching the color drain slightly from his face. "I only told him he would learn it soon enough. I wanted to speak with you first before I said anything further. I wanted to understand why my own invitation to that dinner made you go pale when you first read the card 3 weeks ago." Edmund Hale sank back into his chair, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring into the candle flame as though searching for the right place to begin a story he had clearly hoped never to tell. "Sit down, Alina," he finally said. "There are things I should have told you years ago, and I am ashamed that I did not find the courage sooner." Alina sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. "My name," her father began slowly, "was not always Edmund Hale. I was born Edmund Ashworth, second son of a family that once owned nearly as much land as the Ashfords do now, back when the Ashfords themselves were still climbing toward the wealth they hold today. My father and Reginald's grandfather were partners once, in a shipping venture that was meant to make both families richer than either could imagine alone." He paused, his jaw tightening. "It should have worked. For a time, it did. But Reginald's grandfather grew greedy, and when a storm destroyed 3 of our ships in a single season, he found a way to shift the losses entirely onto my father's shoulders, using forged documents and false testimony to convince the courts that my father alone had mismanaged the venture. My father was ruined within a year. He lost the land, the house, everything our family had built across 3 generations, and the shame of it broke something in him that never healed. He died 2 years later, and I was left with nothing but a name that had become a symbol of failure in every drawing room in this county." Alina felt her chest tighten. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because I did not want you to carry my anger," her father said, his voice softening. "I changed my name and left that life behind because I refused to spend my remaining years fighting a battle I did not believe I could win. I wanted you to grow up free of it, to know kindness and simple joy before you ever learned about greed and betrayal. I told myself that if I stayed quiet long enough, the Ashfords would forget the Ashworth name ever existed, and we would be safe." "But they did not forget," Alina said quietly. Her father shook his head. "No, and when I received word 3 weeks ago that Reginald Ashford himself had requested your presence at his table, I feared it was no accident. I feared he somehow knew who you truly were, and meant to use you against me in some way I could not yet see." "He did not know," Alina said. "I am certain of that now. He invited me the same way he has invited other women before me, as a cruel game meant to entertain his friends. He had no idea my father's name was Ashworth until I told him myself, standing at his own table." Her father let out a long, slow breath, something between relief and dread passing across his weathered face. "Then it seems fate has done what I spent 20 years trying to prevent. The 2 families have collided again, and this time you stand at the center of it." Alina leaned forward. "Tell me the rest, father. What documents were forged? What proof exists that the Ashfords stole what was rightfully ours?" For a long moment, her father simply looked at her, and something like pride began to replace the fear in his eyes. "There is a ledger," he said finally. "My father kept a private record of every transaction in that shipping venture, separate from the official books the courts examined. He hid it before he died, certain that one day someone would need it to prove the truth. I have spent years searching for it quietly, without success. I always assumed it was lost or destroyed long ago." "And if it were found?" Alina asked. "If it were found," her father said slowly, "it would prove that the losses from that storm were split fairly between both families, and that the Ashfords manufactured false evidence to claim the land, the ships, and the fortune that should have remained partly ours. It would not undo everything that has happened since. But it would restore what remains of our name, and it would force the Ashfords to answer for what they did, in front of every court and every drawing room in this county." Alina sat back slowly, her mind racing through everything she had just learned, fitting it together with the look on Reginald Ashford's face when she had spoken her father's old name at the table. He had not recognized it immediately. She realized now, thinking back carefully. He had looked confused more than afraid, as though the name meant something to him only distantly, a story from his family's past that he had never bothered to learn in full detail. That would not last. By morning, his mother would have told him everything. "We do not have much time," Alina said. "If a ledger exists somewhere, we need to find it before the Ashfords realize what threat it poses to them. If Lady Constance remembers the truth of what happened, she may try to bury whatever evidence still remains, if she has not already." Her father studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You sound very certain of yourself tonight, for a woman who spent her entire life believing she was simply the daughter of a baker's neighbor." "I am not the same woman who walked into that dining hall 3 hours ago," Alina said quietly. He made sure of that himself. Meanwhile, across the county, in a very different room lit by far more candles than Alina's small apartment could ever hold, Lord Reginald Ashford paced the length of his study, while his mother sat perfectly still in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her face pale in the flickering light. "Ashworth," Lady Constance repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you certain that was the name she spoke?" "I am certain," Reginald said, running a hand through his hair, a habit he only allowed himself when no guests were present to witness his composure crack. "She said her father had chosen a different name for himself, but that he was born something other than Whitmore. She did not finish the sentence before she left, but I could see it in her eyes, Mother. She wanted me to remember that name. She wanted me to be afraid of it." Lady Constance rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window, staring out at the dark grounds beyond the glass, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the curtain. "Your grandfather never spoke of the Ashworth family in front of you," she said finally. "He forbade it, actually, though I never fully understood why until I married into this family and heard the servants whisper about it late at night, when they believed no one important was listening." "Whispered what?" Reginald demanded. Lady Constance turned to face her son, and for the first time in his memory, Reginald saw something like guilt in his mother's expression. "That your grandfather destroyed a man to build the fortune you now enjoy," she said quietly. "A man named Edmund Ashworth, who disappeared shortly after losing everything, along with his infant daughter. No one ever discovered what became of them. Your grandfather always claimed they had died somewhere abroad, penniless and forgotten." Reginald felt something cold settle in his stomach. "They did not die." "No," Lady Constance said softly, looking toward the window again, as though she could somehow see all the way to the small apartment above the bakery where Alina and her father sat discussing the very same secret. "It seems, my son, that they did not." Reginald stood in silence for a long moment, replaying the entire dinner in his mind, every detail of Alina Whitmore's calm, deliberate curtsy, the steady confidence in her voice as she thanked him for his honesty, the way she had looked at him not with fear, but with something closer to quiet triumph, as though she had been waiting her entire life for exactly that moment. He had spent the evening trying to humiliate a stranger for the entertainment of his friends. He was only now beginning to understand that he had, without realizing it, insulted the one woman in the entire county who held the power to destroy everything his family had spent 3 generations building. "What do we do?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than his mother had heard it in years. Lady Constance turned to face him fully, her expression hardening into something calculating and cold, the same expression Reginald had inherited from her without ever fully recognizing where it came from. "We find her," she said, "before she finds whatever proof her father has spent 20 years searching for, and we make certain, whatever it costs us, that the truth about this family's history never reaches a courtroom." Outside, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep over the hills, and in 2 very different homes across the county, 2 families that had once destroyed each other were beginning, once again, to circle. 3 days passed before Alina allowed herself to leave the small apartment above the bakery. And even then, she moved through the city streets with a caution she had never needed before. Her father had insisted she stay close to home while he made careful inquiries about the ledger. But Alina had never been the kind of woman content to sit and wait while others decided her future for her. And by the fourth morning, she found herself walking briskly toward the modest home of her closest friend, Margaret Ellery, with a plan already forming in her mind. Margaret answered the door herself, still in her morning dress, her dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck. And the moment she saw Alina's face, she pulled her inside without a single question. "You look like a woman who has not slept in days," Margaret said, closing the door firmly behind them. "I have not," Alina admitted, settling into the small kitchen chair Margaret offered her. "Have you heard anything, any talk about what happened at the Ashford dinner?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Heard anything? Alina, it is the only thing anyone in this city has spoken of for 3 days. Half the county believes you are some long-lost noblewoman returned to claim a fortune. The other half believes Lord Ashford invented the entire story himself to distract from his own poor behavior at the table. No one seems to agree on anything except that something extraordinary happened in that dining hall, and everyone wants to know what comes next." Alina rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of the past 3 days pressing down on her more heavily than she had expected. She had known there would be talk, of course. She had not fully understood how quickly it would spread, or how many strangers would suddenly feel entitled to an opinion about her family's private history. "There is more," Alina said quietly. "Far more than anyone in this city could possibly guess. My father was born Edmund Ashworth. His family was destroyed by Reginald Ashford's grandfather through fraud, forged documents, false claims in court. There is supposedly a ledger somewhere, hidden by my grandfather before he died, that would prove the truth of what happened." Margaret's mouth fell open slightly. "A ledger? Alina, do you have any idea what that means? If such a document exists, and if it can be found, it could restore everything your family lost. It could ruin the Ashfords entirely." "I know," Alina said, "which is precisely why I fear we are not the only ones searching for it." As if summoned by the thought itself, a sharp knock sounded at Margaret's front door, and both women startled at the sudden noise. Margaret rose cautiously and crossed the small room, peering through the narrow window beside the door before opening it just enough to reveal a well-dressed young woman standing on the front step, her expression carefully arranged into polite curiosity. "Charlotte," Margaret said, her voice flat with poorly concealed suspicion, "what brings you here?" Charlotte Vane smiled, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, and glanced past Margaret's shoulder into the small kitchen where Alina sat watching carefully. "I heard Miss Whitmore might be here," Charlotte said sweetly. "I simply wanted to offer my congratulations, of course, on such a memorable evening at the Ashford estate. The whole county is talking about you, Alina. Some say you are secretly a princess in disguise." "I am no princess," Alina said carefully, rising from her chair though she remained near the kitchen table, unwilling to invite Charlotte any further into the house than necessary. Charlotte had been one of the guests at Lord Ashford's table that evening, seated near the far end, close enough to witness everything, and far enough to avoid any direct involvement. Alina had heard rumors before that night that Charlotte harbored her own hopes of eventually becoming Lady Ashford, hopes that had likely been complicated significantly by the events of the past few days. "Well, whatever you are," Charlotte continued, her smile tightening just slightly, "Lord Ashford has been asking after you rather urgently. I understand he sent a letter to your residence yesterday morning, though I heard it went unanswered." Alina's stomach tightened. She had received no such letter, which meant either it had been intercepted somewhere between the Ashford estate and her father's apartment, or Charlotte was testing her, watching carefully for whatever reaction her words might provoke. "I have received no letters," Alina said carefully, giving nothing away in her expression. Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly just for a moment before her polite smile returned. "How strange! Well, I am certain he will find another way to reach you. Lord Ashford is not a man accustomed to being ignored, as I am sure you noticed at dinner. I noticed a great many things at dinner, Alina said evenly. Something flickered behind Charlotte's eyes, and for just a moment the careful mask of polite curiosity slipped, revealing something sharper and more calculating underneath. Take care, Alina. Powerful families do not enjoy being threatened, even by women with impressive curtsies and mysterious surnames. With that, Charlotte turned and walked briskly back down the front path, her skirts swishing sharply against the cobblestones, leaving both Alina and Margaret standing in stunned silence. She knows something, Margaret said quietly, closing the door and locking it firmly behind her. Or she suspects something at the very least. Alina, you need to be careful. If word has already reached Charlotte Vane, it will not be long before it reaches people far more dangerous than her. Alina nodded slowly, her mind already racing ahead to the missing letter Charlotte had mentioned, wondering who might have intercepted it and why. She thanked Margaret for her hospitality, promised to send word if anything further developed, and left quickly, choosing side streets rather than the main road on her walk back toward the bakery, glancing over her shoulder more than once along the way. When she arrived home, she found her father seated at the small table near the window, a stack of old papers spread out in front of him, his reading glasses perched low on his nose as he examined each document carefully in the afternoon light. I may have found something, he said without looking up, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. An old friend of my father's, a man named Percival Bennett, served as a lawyer during the original dispute over the shipping venture. He is retired now, quite elderly, but I managed to send word to him yesterday, and he replied this morning. What did he say? Alina asked, moving quickly to stand beside him. He remembers the case well, her father said. He says he always suspected the documents used against my father in court were forged, though he could never prove it at the time. And he says he believes the original ledger, if it survived at all, would likely have been hidden somewhere on the old Ashworth property itself, the land that was seized by the Ashfords following the ruling. Alina felt her pulse quicken. The land is still owned by the Ashfords. It is, her father said grimly. It has been part of their eastern estate for over 20 years. The old family house still stands there, though I understand it has been used only for storage in recent years. If the ledger survived, it is most likely hidden somewhere within those walls. Alina sat down slowly across from her father, processing the enormity of what he was suggesting. You want us to search the property of the very family we are trying to expose. I do not see another way, her father admitted. Mr. Bennett believes the ledger's existence was never fully investigated during the original trial because the court accepted the forged documents without question. If it still exists, it has likely remained undisturbed for over 20 years, hidden wherever my father originally placed it. And if we are caught searching the Ashford estate, Alina said slowly, we will hand them every excuse they need to have us arrested, or worse, to discredit anything we might later claim to have found. Her father's expression darkened. I am aware of the risk, Alina, which is precisely why I do not wish for you to be the one who goes. Then who? Alina demanded. You cannot go yourself, father. If anyone recognizes you, if anyone connects your face to the Ashworth name, everything we are trying to protect will be lost before we even begin. Her father said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the papers spread across the table, and Alina could see the familiar weight of worry settling over his features, the same expression she remembered from her childhood whenever money grew scarce or the future felt uncertain. There may be another way, he said finally. Oliver has friends among the Ashford household staff, people who remember the old days, who might still hold some loyalty toward our family despite everything that has happened since. If we could find someone within the estate willing to help us, someone who could search the old house discreetly, without drawing suspicion. Alina considered this for a long moment. It would still be dangerous for whoever agreed to help us. Everything about this is dangerous, her father said quietly. It has been dangerous since the moment you accepted that invitation 3 weeks ago, though neither of us understood it fully at the time. That evening, Oliver arrived at the small apartment just after dark, his weathered face grim as he settled into the chair Alina offered him near the window. "I spoke with an old friend today," he said without preamble. "A woman named Agnes who has served in the Ashford household for nearly 30 years. She remembers your grandfather, Alina. She remembers the old Ashworth house before it fell into disrepair. And she says she has never trusted the Ashford family, not truly, not since she overheard things as a young girl that she was never meant to hear." "Will she help us?" Alina asked. Oliver nodded slowly. "She has agreed to search the old house herself, quietly, when her duties allow. She says there is a cellar beneath the eastern wing that has not been properly cleared in decades, filled with old furniture and boxes left behind when the property changed hands. If your grandfather hid something within those walls, it is the most likely place it would still remain." Alina felt a fragile thread of hope tighten in her chest, mixed with a deep unease she could not fully shake. Every step forward felt like walking further into danger, closer to a family with more wealth and power than her own could ever hope to match, armed with nothing more than an old story and the faint possibility of proof that might no longer even exist. "How long will it take her to search?" Alina asked. She could not say for certain, Oliver admitted. But she promised to send word the moment she finds anything, or the moment she believes it is no longer safe to continue looking. That night, after Oliver had gone and her father had finally retired to bed, exhausted from the weight of everything the day had brought, Alina sat alone by the window, staring out at the dark street below, thinking of Charlotte Vane's carefully veiled warning, of the missing letter that had never reached her hands, of Lady Constance's cold, calculating gaze that she had never actually witnessed, but could easily imagine from everything her father had told her about the family's history. She thought, too, of Reginald Ashford himself, of the way his confident, cruel expression had faltered the moment she spoke her father's old name aloud, the flicker of genuine uncertainty that had crossed his face just before she turned and walked away. He did not yet understand what he was facing. Not fully. But he would, soon enough, and Alina found herself wondering, with a strange and unexpected curiosity, exactly how a man like Reginald Ashford would respond when he finally understood the full weight of what his family had done, and what it might now cost him. Whatever answer waited for her, she knew one thing with complete certainty as she finally rose from the window and made her way toward her own small bed. There was no turning back now. The thread had been pulled, and the only path left was forward, deeper into a story that had begun long before she was born, and would not end until every truth buried within it had finally been dragged into the light. Reginald Ashford had never once, in 30 years of life, thought to ask his grandfather uncomfortable questions about the fortune he had inherited. Fortunes, in his experience, simply existed, the way rivers existed, or mountains, permanent and unquestioned, present since long before he was born and certain to remain long after he was gone. He had grown up in a house filled with fine paintings and imported furniture, had attended the finest schools money could arrange, had never once needed to wonder where any of it had come from. Now, sitting alone in his study 3 days after the dinner that had upended everything he believed about his own family, he found himself wondering for the first time in his life whether any of it had been earned honestly at all. He had spent the previous evening going through his grandfather's old correspondence, boxes of yellowed letters and documents stored in the estate's records room, searching for any mention of the name Ashworth. Most of it told him nothing new: business dealings, land purchases, the ordinary paperwork of a wealthy family expanding its holdings across several decades. But buried near the bottom of the third box, he found a single letter that made his blood run cold. It was written in his grandfather's own hand, addressed to no one in particular, as though it had been drafted and never sent, perhaps intended only as a private confession the old man had never found the courage to deliver. The letter spoke of a partnership gone wrong, of a storm that destroyed 3 ships, of losses that threatened to ruin his grandfather entirely, unless a solution could be found quickly. It spoke of a decision made in desperation, a choice to shift blame onto a partner who had trusted him completely, using documents altered just enough to convince a court that had never thought to question a man of his grandfather's standing. The letter did not use the name Ashworth directly, but it did not need to. Reginald understood immediately, reading those careful, guilty words, exactly whose ruin his grandfather had been confessing to, even if only to himself, even if only on a page he had never intended anyone else to read. He sat with that letter for a long time, the candle beside him burning lower and lower, while the full weight of what his family had built settled over him like a stone dropped into still water. Everything he owned, every advantage he had ever taken for granted, had been built, at least in part, on the ruin of another family. A family that Alina Whitmore, it seemed, belonged to. He thought of her curtsy again, the slow, deliberate grace of it, and understood now with a clarity that made him faintly sick that it had not been theater at all. It had been proof. A woman raised in poverty above a bakery did not simply know how to curtsy like that, did not simply carry herself with that kind of composed, aristocratic bearing, unless someone had spent years teaching her, carefully, deliberately, preparing her for exactly the kind of moment she had just lived through at his table. Her father had trained her for this. Whether he had known this particular dinner was coming or not, he had clearly spent years preparing his daughter for the day the Ashford name and the Ashworth name would collide again. Reginald folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat, unwilling to leave it lying in the records room where a servant might stumble across it, or worse, where his mother might find it and decide, as she so often did, that the safest course of action was simply to destroy anything inconvenient before it could cause trouble. He needed to speak with Alina Whitmore directly, not through letters that might be intercepted, not through careful third parties who could report back only fragments of the truth, but face to face, where he could watch her expression and judge for himself exactly how much she truly knew, and exactly what she intended to do with that knowledge. The following afternoon, he rode alone to the small street above the bakery, having learned her address through a discreet inquiry to one of his household staff, a young man named Timothy, who seemed to know a surprising amount about the comings and goings of half the city. He left his horse tied at the corner and walked the remaining distance on foot, unwilling to draw attention with his usual carriage and its distinctive Ashford crest painted on the door. Alina answered the door herself, and the moment she saw him standing on the narrow step outside, her expression shifted from surprise to something far more guarded. "Lord Ashford," she said carefully, glancing past him toward the street, checking, he realized, whether anyone had seen him arrive. "This is unexpected." "May I speak with you?" he asked. "Alone, if your father permits it. I have no intention of causing trouble, Miss Whitmore, I give you my word." Alina studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching his face for something, some sign of the arrogant, cruel man who had insulted her at his own table just days earlier. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, at least partially, because she finally stepped aside and allowed him into the small front room, though she left the door open behind him, a clear signal that this visit would be brief and closely watched. "You look troubled," Alina observed, crossing her arms as she studied him. "Not the same man who called me plain in front of 30 guests." Reginald winced slightly at the reminder, though he supposed he deserved every bit of the discomfort it brought. "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitmore. A genuine one, not the kind performed for an audience. What I said at dinner was cruel and unnecessary, and I have thought of little else since you walked out of that hall." "I did not come to your house expecting an apology," Alina said, though something in her expression softened slightly, just enough for Reginald to notice. "But I will accept one if it is sincerely offered." "It is," he said. "Though I confess my visit today is not solely about apologies." He reached into his coat and withdrew the folded letter, holding it out toward her, though he did not yet release it from his grasp. "I found this among my grandfather's private papers. I believe it confirms everything you were suggesting at my table 3 nights ago." Alina's eyes widened slightly, and she reached for the letter, though Reginald hesitated for just a moment before finally allowing her to take it from his hand. She read it slowly, her expression darkening with each line, and when she finally looked up at him again, there was something raw and unguarded in her face that had not been present since the moment she walked into his dining hall. "This confirms what my father told me," she said quietly. "Your grandfather forged documents to shift the blame for the storm's losses entirely onto my grandfather's shoulders. He destroyed our family to protect his own fortune." "It appears so," Reginald admitted, his voice heavy with something Alina had never expected to hear from him, genuine shame. "I did not know, Miss Whitmore. I want you to understand that. I grew up believing my family's wealth was simply the natural result of good business decisions made across several generations. I never once thought to question where it truly came from." Alina folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest, as though protecting it from some invisible threat. "Why show this to me? You could have destroyed it. No one else knows it exists." "Because destroying it would make me exactly the kind of man my grandfather was," Reginald said quietly. "And because, whatever else is true between our families, I do not believe I can build any kind of future, for myself, or for the Ashford name, on a foundation of lies I now know to be false." Alina studied him carefully, weighing his words, searching his face once again for any sign of deception. She had spent her entire life being taught patience, caution, the careful reading of people's true intentions beneath their polished words. Everything in her training told her to remain guarded, to trust nothing this man said until it had been proven beyond doubt. And yet, standing in her small front room, watching the genuine discomfort in his expression, she found herself believing him, at least for now. "There is more," she said finally. "A ledger hidden somewhere on what used to be my grandfather's property before your family took possession of it after the trial. It would prove everything this letter suggests, with far more detail and legal weight than a single private confession ever could." Reginald's expression shifted into something sharper, more focused. "The old house on the eastern estate. I have not set foot inside it in years. It has been used only for storage since I was a boy." "My father believes the ledger may be hidden in the cellar," Alina said. "We have already arranged for someone to search, quietly, without drawing attention." "Who?" Reginald asked. Alina hesitated, unwilling to reveal Agnes's name and risk putting the elderly woman in danger, especially now that Reginald himself had appeared at her door with such unexpected honesty. "Someone trustworthy," she said carefully. "That is all I am prepared to say for now." Reginald nodded slowly, understanding her caution even as something like disappointment flickered across his features. "Then let me help in whatever way I can. It is my family's property. I could arrange access far more easily than anyone working in secret, and far more safely." Alina studied him for a long moment, considering the offer carefully, weighing the risk of trusting him against the very real danger of continuing to search his family's property without his knowledge or assistance. "If my mother learns what you are doing," Reginald added quietly, as though reading the doubt still lingering in her expression, "she will do everything in her power to stop it and to protect our family's reputation, whatever the cost. I understand if you do not trust me completely, Miss Whitmore. I have given you little reason to. But I am offering my help regardless, because I believe it is the right thing to do, and because I find myself, rather unexpectedly, wanting to make amends for more than simply one cruel remark at a dinner table." Alina said nothing for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over the small room between them. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of the street, carts rolling over cobblestones, the faint calls of vendors selling their wares, the ordinary rhythm of a city entirely unaware of the quiet, dangerous negotiation taking place within these four walls. "I will consider your offer," she said finally, "but I will not make any promises tonight, Lord Ashford. Trust is not something I extend easily, especially not to a man who so recently called me plain in front of 30 strangers." A faint, rueful smile touched the corner of Reginald's mouth, the first genuine warmth Alina had seen from him since they met. That seems fair, Miss Whitmore. I will earn it then, rather than ask for it freely. He took his leave shortly after, promising to send word if he learned anything further about the old house or his mother's intentions. And Alina watched from the window as he walked back down the narrow street, toward the corner where his horse waited. His shoulders set in a way that seemed different somehow from the arrogant, careless posture he had carried at his own dinner table just days earlier. Her father emerged from the back room the moment the door closed, his expression tight with worry. "I heard everything," he admitted. "Alina, you cannot trust him. Not yet, perhaps not ever." "I know," Alina said quietly, still watching the empty street through the window. "But I believe for now that he is telling the truth. And if he can help us find that ledger safely, without risking Agnes's position or drawing his mother's suspicion, it may be worth the risk of trusting him, just a little." Her father studied her for a long moment, and Alina could see the familiar worry in his eyes, the same worry that had shaped so many of his decisions across her entire life, the fear of losing everything a second time, of watching his daughter walk into the same kind of danger that had once destroyed his own father so completely. "Be careful," he said finally. "Whatever happens next, Alina, be very careful." Alina nodded, though even as she did, she felt the familiar pull of the story tightening around her once again, drawing her deeper into a conflict that had begun long before she was born and showed no sign of resolving itself gently. Somewhere across the city, in a grand house full of secrets, Lady Constance Ashford was already beginning to suspect that her son's recent behavior had grown strange, distracted, unlike the confident, careless young man she had raised him to be. And somewhere beneath the old Ashworth house, buried in a cellar filled with decades of forgotten furniture and dust, an elderly woman named Agnes moved slowly through the darkness with a single lantern, searching for a truth that 3 generations of 2 powerful families had spent 20 years trying to bury. Agnes had worked within the walls of the Ashford estate for nearly 30 years, long enough to know every creaking floorboard, every drafty corridor, every forgotten room that the family itself had stopped visiting decades earlier. The old Ashworth house stood at the far eastern edge of the property, separated from the main estate by a stretch of overgrown garden that the current gardening staff rarely bothered to maintain, and Agnes had chosen her moments carefully, slipping away during the quiet afternoon hours when most of the household staff took their brief rest before evening duties began. The cellar beneath the eastern wing was exactly as she remembered it from her younger years, damp and dim, filled with the accumulated clutter of 2 decades, broken furniture stacked in uneven piles, wooden crates coated in a thick layer of dust, the faint smell of mildew hanging heavy in the still air. She had brought a single lantern, its light casting long, shifting shadows across the stone walls as she moved carefully between the towers of forgotten belongings, searching methodically through crate after crate, box after box, growing more discouraged with each hour that passed without success. On the 4th afternoon of searching, exhausted and nearly ready to abandon hope entirely, Agnes found a small wooden chest tucked behind a collapsed bookshelf in the farthest corner of the cellar, half buried beneath a moth-eaten tapestry that had clearly not been touched in decades. The chest was locked, its metal clasp rusted nearly solid with age, and it took her several minutes of careful effort with an old iron poker before the lock finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed unpleasantly through the empty cellar. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, she found a thick leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed but remarkably intact, filled with careful, precise handwriting that recorded, in exhaustive detail, every transaction of a shipping venture that had ended more than 20 years earlier. Agnes's hands trembled as she lifted the ledger from its hiding place, understanding immediately, even without reading a single word, exactly what she had found. She wrapped it back in its protective cloth, tucked it carefully beneath her arm, and made her way quickly back through the cellar, up the narrow stairs, and out into the overgrown garden, her heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and fear that made her steps quicken despite her aging knees. She did not notice, until it was almost too late, the figure watching her from the shadow of the garden wall. "Agnes," Lady Constance said quietly, stepping forward into the fading afternoon light, her expression carefully composed though her eyes carried a sharpness that made Agnes's blood run cold. "What exactly are you carrying?" Agnes froze, her grip tightening instinctively around the wrapped ledger beneath her arm. She had served the Ashford family for 30 years, had watched Lady Constance grow from a young bride into the formidable woman who now stood before her, and she understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how much danger she had placed herself in. "Nothing of importance, my lady," Agnes said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Simply some old linens I found while clearing the cellar." Lady Constance's eyes narrowed, and she took a slow step closer, close enough that Agnes could smell the faint scent of lavender perfume that always seemed to surround her. "You have served this family long enough, Agnes, for me to know when you are lying to me. Show me what you are carrying." For a long, tense moment, Agnes considered running, though she knew immediately that her aging legs would never outpace a woman half her age across the open garden. She considered lying further, insisting on her innocent explanation, though she could see clearly in Lady Constance's expression that no further lies would be believed. In the end, she chose the only path that offered any hope of protecting what she had found. She unwrapped the ledger just enough to show a single corner of its leather cover, watching Lady Constance's face carefully for any reaction. Lady Constance went very still. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice suddenly quiet, dangerous in a way that made Agnes's chest tighten with fear. "In the cellar of the old house, my lady," Agnes admitted, seeing no further point in continuing the pretense. "Hidden in a chest behind the old bookshelf." Lady Constance extended her hand, palm up, her expression giving nothing away. "Give it to me." Agnes hesitated, torn between 30 years of trained obedience and a growing certainty that handing over the ledger now would undo everything Alina and her father had worked so carefully to accomplish. She thought of Edmund Hale, whom she had known briefly many years earlier before his family's ruin scattered them across the county, thought of the quiet dignity he had always carried even in the darkest years following his father's death, and she found, to her own surprise, that she could not bring herself to comply. "I am sorry, my lady," Agnes said quietly, taking a small step backward. "But I do not believe this ledger belongs to your family. I believe it belongs to the family it was stolen from." Lady Constance's expression hardened into something cold and furious, though she kept her voice carefully controlled, aware, perhaps, that raised voices might draw unwanted attention from elsewhere on the estate. "You forget your place," she said sharply. "You are a servant in this household, nothing more. Give me that ledger immediately, or I will have you dismissed without reference, and you will spend the remainder of your years explaining to every household in this county exactly why the Ashford family found you unsuitable for continued employment." Agnes felt fear tighten in her chest, the threat carrying real weight, real danger to the modest security she had built across 3 decades of loyal service. But beneath that fear, something steadier held firm, a quiet certainty that had been growing within her since the moment she first agreed to help Alina and her father, a sense that some things mattered more than her own comfort and safety. "Then dismiss me," Agnes said, her voice steadier now than she expected it to be. "But I will not hand you the proof of what your family did to destroy an innocent man." Before Lady Constance could respond, a new voice cut sharply across the garden. "Mother, what is happening here?" Reginald stood at the edge of the overgrown path, having come looking for Agnes after receiving word from Alina that the search had entered its 4th day without success, arriving at precisely the moment his mother's confrontation had reached its most dangerous point. Lady Constance turned toward her son, her expression shifting rapidly from cold fury into something more carefully composed, though Reginald had known her far too long to be fooled by the transformation. "Nothing that concerns you, Reginald," she said smoothly. "Agnes was simply removing some old belongings from the cellar. I was merely inquiring about their disposal." "That is not what I heard," Reginald said, his eyes moving between his mother's tense expression and Agnes's trembling hands, still clutching the wrapped ledger against her chest. "Agnes, are you well?" "I am well, my lord," Agnes said carefully, though her eyes flickered nervously toward Lady Constance, uncertain how much honesty her employer's presence would allow. Reginald stepped closer, his gaze settling deliberately on the object Agnes held so tightly against her body. "Is that the ledger?" Lady Constance's composure cracked slightly at the question. "You know about this?" "I found grandfather's letter 3 days ago," Reginald said, his voice hardening as he turned fully to face his mother. "The confession he never sent, describing exactly what he did to Edmund Ashworth 20 years ago. I have been searching for proof ever since, hoping to understand the full truth before deciding what to do about it." "You would destroy this family's reputation," Lady Constance said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "for the sake of a woman you met only days ago." "I would rather destroy this family's reputation," Reginald said steadily, "than continue building our future on a foundation of lies and stolen fortune. Whatever grandfather did, mother, it was wrong, and I refuse to spend the rest of my life pretending otherwise simply to protect a name that was never truly earned in the first place." Lady Constance stared at her son for a long, tense moment, something like genuine shock crossing her carefully composed features, as though she were seeing him clearly for the first time in years. "You have changed," she said finally, her voice quieter now though no less troubled. "That woman has changed you." "Perhaps she has," Reginald admitted. "Perhaps it was long past time someone did." He turned to Agnes, his expression softening. "Take the ledger to Miss Whitmore immediately. I will handle matters here with my mother." Agnes hesitated only a moment longer before nodding gratefully and hurrying away down the garden path, the precious ledger still clutched tightly against her chest, leaving mother and son alone in the fading afternoon light. "You understand what this means," Lady Constance said quietly, once Agnes had disappeared from view. "If that ledger becomes public, if it reaches a courtroom, we could lose everything, Reginald. The land, the fortune, the standing this family has held for 3 generations. Everything your grandfather built, everything I have spent my own life protecting and expanding." "I understand," Reginald said, "and I have decided that I would rather lose all of it honestly than continue holding it dishonestly for even one more day." Lady Constance's eyes glistened briefly, though whether with anger or something closer to sorrow, Reginald could not entirely tell. "Your grandfather would be ashamed of you." "Perhaps," Reginald said quietly, "but I find, rather unexpectedly, that I no longer care whether he would be proud or ashamed. I care only about what I can look at honestly in the mirror each morning, and I have not been able to do that comfortably in quite some time, mother, long before Elena Whitmore ever walked into our dining hall." He left her standing alone in the overgrown garden, her carefully composed expression finally beginning to crumble now that no one remained to witness it, and made his way quickly toward the main house, already composing in his mind the letter he intended to send Elena that very evening, informing her that the ledger had finally been found, and that the truth her family had waited 20 years to reclaim was, at long last, within reach. By the time Agnes arrived, breathless and trembling at the small apartment above the bakery, Elena and her father were seated together at their worn kitchen table, having spent the entire afternoon in tense, anxious silence, waiting for any word from the estate. The moment Agnes unwrapped the leather-bound ledger and placed it carefully on the table between them, Edmund Hale's hands began to shake, and for a long moment he simply stared at it, unable to speak, unable to fully believe that the proof he had spent 20 years searching for now rested directly in front of him. "Father," Elena said softly, watching the emotion overwhelm him. "Open it." With trembling hands, Edmund Hale finally turned back the leather cover and began to read, page by careful page, the detailed record his own father had kept, proof at last of everything that had been stolen from their family 2 decades earlier. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over the city, casting long golden light through the small apartment's windows. And for the first time in 20 years, Edmund Hale allowed himself to weep, not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. The quiet, overwhelming relief of a man who had finally, after so many years of silence and hiding, found his way back to the truth. News of the ledger's discovery could not remain quiet for long. Not in a city where half the drawing rooms had already spent a week whispering about the strange scene at Lord Ashford's dinner table. Within days, rumors began circulating through every social circle that mattered, growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until half the county believed Alina Whitmore had personally broken into the Ashford estate under cover of darkness, and the other half insisted she had somehow bewitched Reginald Ashford into betraying his own family for her sake. Alina paid little attention to the rumors themselves, though her father worried constantly about how quickly the situation was slipping beyond their control. What mattered now was Mr. Percival Bennet, who had agreed, despite his advanced age and failing eyesight, to review the ledger personally and confirm whether it held the legal weight necessary to overturn a ruling that had stood unchallenged for 20 years. He arrived at their apartment on a gray, overcast morning, moving slowly with the aid of a wooden cane, his sharp eyes belying the frailty of his aging body. Alina watched anxiously as he spread the ledger's pages carefully across the kitchen table, examining each entry with the same meticulous attention he must have once brought to every case in his long career as a lawyer. "This is remarkable," he said finally, after nearly 2 hours of careful study, removing his spectacles and rubbing his tired eyes. "Your grandfather kept detailed records of every transaction, every ship, every cargo manifest, cross-referenced against the official court documents I still have copies of from the original trial. The discrepancies are undeniable, Mr. Hale. The documents used against your father 20 years ago were altered, quite skillfully, but altered nonetheless. This ledger proves it beyond reasonable doubt." Edmund Hale sank into his chair, his hands still trembling slightly even now, days after the ledger's discovery. "Then we can bring this before a court." "We can," Bennet confirmed. "Though I must warn you both, the Ashford family will not surrender their fortune easily, regardless of how compelling this evidence proves to be. They have resources, connections, lawyers far younger and more aggressive than an old man like myself. This will not be a simple matter, even with proof this strong in our possession." Alina's jaw tightened with determination. "We did not come this far to turn back now, Mr. Bennet. Whatever resources the Ashfords bring against us, we will face them." Bennet studied her for a long moment, something like admiration crossing his weathered features. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Miss Whitmore. I remember him well from many years ago. He had exactly this kind of quiet determination, right up until the day the court ruling destroyed him entirely." "Then let us make certain history does not repeat itself," Alina said firmly. Across the city, within the grand walls of the Ashford estate, Lady Constance had spent the past several days in a state of barely controlled fury, summoning her family's longtime lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Godfrey Pierce, to discuss exactly how much danger the discovered ledger posed to their fortune. "The document itself may be genuine," Pierce admitted cautiously, seated across from Lady Constance in her private study. "But genuine evidence does not automatically overturn a ruling that has stood for 2 decades, my lady. Courts are reluctant to reopen settled cases, particularly cases involving families as prominent as your own. We have options available to us, if you are willing to pursue them." "What options?" Lady Constance demanded. "We could challenge the ledger's authenticity directly," Pierce suggested. "Argue that it was fabricated recently, specifically to extort your family. We could also pursue a private settlement, offering the Hale family a modest sum in exchange for their silence and the ledger's destruction, avoiding a public court battle entirely." Lady Constance considered this carefully, though something in her expression suggested she found neither option entirely satisfying. "And if they refuse a settlement?" "Then we fight in court," Pierce said simply. "And we make certain," through whatever legal means available to us, that the process takes as long and costs as much as possible, until the Hale family either exhausts their resources or their resolve, whichever comes first. It was, Lady Constance reflected privately, exactly the kind of ruthless, patient strategy her late husband's father would have employed without hesitation. And for a brief moment, she felt the familiar comfort of falling back into old, practiced patterns of protecting the family fortune by any means necessary. But then she thought of her son's face in the garden 3 days earlier, the quiet, unshakable conviction in his voice as he told her he would rather lose everything honestly than continue holding it dishonestly, and something in her resolve wavered, just slightly, in a way it never had before. "Draft the settlement offer," she said finally, "but keep the figure reasonable. I do not wish to insult them further, only to end this matter as quietly as possible." Reginald, when he learned of his mother's plan 2 days later, confronted her immediately in the same study where the offer had been drafted, his expression tight with barely contained frustration. "You cannot buy their silence," he said sharply. "Mother, this is not about money. Alina does not want a settlement. She wants the truth acknowledged publicly, and her father's name restored." "Everyone has a price, Reginald," Lady Constance said tiredly, though something in her voice suggested even she no longer fully believed her own words. "Perhaps not the exact price we have offered, but a price nonetheless." "Not this family," Reginald said firmly. "Not after everything your husband's father did to destroy them. Offering money now, quietly, without any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, is simply another form of the same arrogance that caused this entire situation to begin with." Lady Constance studied her son for a long moment, and Reginald could see, beneath her carefully composed exterior, a deep and genuine exhaustion, the weariness of a woman who had spent decades protecting a fortune built on a foundation she had only recently discovered was rotten at its core. "What would you have me do instead?" she asked finally, her voice quieter than Reginald had heard it in years. "Accept the truth," Reginald said simply, "publicly. Restore what remains recoverable of their fortune and reputation, and allow the courts to formally acknowledge what grandfather did, rather than trying to bury it beneath another layer of secrecy and quiet payments. That could destroy this family's standing entirely," Lady Constance warned. "Every door that has ever opened for us because of the Ashford name could close permanently." "Then let them close," Reginald said. "I would rather live honestly with less than continue living comfortably with a lie." The settlement offer, when it finally arrived at Alina's small apartment 3 days later, carried none of the acknowledgement Reginald had argued for, only a modest sum of money and a request, phrased with careful legal precision, for the ledger's permanent surrender and the family's agreement never to pursue the matter further in any court. Alina read the letter twice, her expression hardening with each careful, calculated phrase, before finally setting it down on the kitchen table in front of her father. "They offer money," she said flatly, "but no truth, no acknowledgement. Simply an attempt to make this entire matter disappear as quietly and cheaply as possible." Her father studied the letter carefully, his weathered face unreadable for a long moment. "It is more money than we have seen in many years, Alina. It would provide security, comfort, a chance to finally rest after 2 decades of struggle." "Is that what you want?" Alina asked quietly. "After everything, father, simply to take their money and disappear back into obscurity while they continue holding a fortune built on your father's ruin?" Edmund Hale was silent for a long moment, staring down at the letter, weighing 20 years of exhaustion against a lifetime of quiet, patient anger that had never fully faded despite his best efforts to bury it. "No," he said finally, his voice steady now, stronger than Alina had heard it in weeks. "That is not what I want. I want the truth known, publicly, formally, in whatever court will hear it. I want my father's name restored, not bought back with a modest sum meant to keep us quiet." Alina felt a surge of pride swell in her chest, watching her father find, at last, the same steady resolve she had discovered within herself the moment she rose from her chair at Lord Ashford's table, and delivered that slow, deliberate curtsy that had set this entire chain of events into motion. "Then we refuse their offer," she said firmly, "and we take this matter before a court whatever the cost." That evening, Alina sent word to Reginald informing him of their decision, and his reply arrived within hours, brief but unmistakably resolute. "I expected nothing less," he wrote, "and I will stand with you when this matter reaches the courtroom, whatever it costs my own family's standing. The truth deserves acknowledgement, not a quiet payment meant to bury it further." Alina read his letter 3 times before finally setting it aside, feeling, for the first time since that humiliating dinner nearly 2 weeks earlier, something that felt strangely and unexpectedly close to hope. The following morning, Mr. Bennet filed the necessary papers to formally reopen the original court case, citing new evidence that directly contradicted the ruling handed down 20 years earlier. Within days, the news spread through every corner of the county, reaching far beyond the drawing rooms and dinner parties where it had first begun as idle gossip, until even the newspapers began printing careful, speculative accounts of the unfolding scandal. The Ashford family's reputation, built carefully across 3 generations, stood now on the edge of a reckoning 2 decades in the making, and Alina Whitmore, the quiet woman once dismissed as plain at a dinner table full of powerful strangers, found herself standing at the very center of it, no longer hiding, no longer waiting patiently in the shadows, but moving forward deliberately and without fear toward whatever truth the coming trial would finally fully reveal. The courtroom was smaller than Alina had imagined, its wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use, its high windows letting in pale morning light that fell across the crowded room in long, quiet beams. She sat beside her father at the front table, Mr. Bennet arranged carefully beside them with the ledger and its accompanying documents spread out for easy reference, while behind them, every available seat had filled with spectators eager to witness the unfolding scandal that had consumed the county's attention for weeks. Across the narrow aisle, Lady Constance sat rigidly beside her own lawyer, Godfrey Pierce, her expression carefully composed despite the visible tension in her shoulders. Reginald sat beside his mother, though Alina noticed immediately that he had chosen to position himself slightly apart from her, close enough to maintain the appearance of family unity, distant enough to signal, to anyone paying careful attention, that his loyalties in this matter no longer aligned entirely with his mother's wishes. The judge, an elderly man named Justice Harmon, called the proceedings to order with practiced efficiency, and the long, careful process of presenting evidence began. Mr. Bennet spoke first, walking the court through the ledger's contents with the same meticulous precision he had shown Alina and her father weeks earlier, cross-referencing each entry against the original trial documents, highlighting discrepancy after discrepancy that could not be explained by simple error or coincidence. Justice Harmon listened carefully, occasionally interrupting with sharp, precise questions that Bennet answered with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Godfrey Pierce, when his turn came, argued forcefully that the ledger's sudden appearance after 20 years of silence raised serious questions about its authenticity, suggesting, without directly accusing anyone of wrongdoing, that such a convenient discovery deserved careful scrutiny before the court accepted it as legitimate evidence. It was Charlotte Vane's testimony, unexpected and unplanned, that ultimately shifted the proceedings in a direction no one in the courtroom had anticipated. She had been called, initially, only to testify about the events at Lord Ashford's original dinner, a minor witness meant to confirm the timeline of when Alina first revealed her father's true identity. But under careful questioning from Bennet, Charlotte's composed testimony began to unravel, revealing details she had clearly not intended to share. "You visited Miss Whitmore's friend shortly after the dinner," Bennet said carefully, "and you mentioned a letter sent by Lord Ashford that Miss Whitmore claimed never to have received. How did you know about that letter, Miss Vane, if you were not present when it was sent?" Charlotte's composed expression flickered, just slightly, and Alina watched with growing interest as the young woman's careful poise began to crack under the weight of the question. Charlotte hesitated, glancing briefly toward Lady Constance before quickly looking away. I heard about it from a member of the Ashford household staff. Which member? Bennet pressed. I do not recall, Charlotte said, though her voice had grown noticeably tighter. Isn't it true, Bennet continued, his voice calm but relentless, that Lady Constance Ashford asked you to monitor Miss Whitmore's activities in the days following the dinner, in exchange for certain social favors and introductions you had long hoped to receive? A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the courtroom, and Alina saw Lady Constance's expression tighten sharply, her composed mask slipping for just a moment before she managed to restore it. Charlotte's face had gone pale. I do not see how that is relevant to the ledger's authenticity. It is relevant, Bennet said firmly, because it demonstrates a pattern of behavior on the part of the Ashford family, an effort to monitor, intimidate, and control the narrative surrounding this case, rather than allowing the truth to emerge through proper legal channels. If Lady Constance was willing to enlist private surveillance against my clients, the court might reasonably wonder what other measures she considered, or attempted, to suppress evidence that threatened her family's fortune. Objection, Pierce called sharply, rising from his seat. Counsel is speculating well beyond the scope of this witness's testimony. Sustained, Justice Harmon said, though Alina noticed the elderly judge's sharp eyes lingering thoughtfully on Lady Constance for a long moment before he gestured for the proceedings to continue. Charlotte was excused shortly after, practically fleeing the witness stand, her earlier confidence entirely replaced by visible embarrassment as she hurried toward the courtroom's rear exit, avoiding eye contact with everyone she passed. The trial continued for 3 more days, each session bringing further scrutiny to the ledger's contents, further testimony from aging witnesses who remembered fragments of the original scandal from 20 years earlier, further careful arguments from both sides about the legal weight such evidence deserved after so many years of silence. On the final day, Justice Harmon called the courtroom to order one last time, his expression grave and thoughtful as he prepared to deliver his ruling. Alina sat rigidly beside her father, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, hardly daring to breathe as the elderly judge began to speak. This court has carefully examined the evidence presented, Justice Harmon began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room, including the ledger discovered on the Ashford estate, the testimony of witnesses both credible and questionable, and the original documents from the trial conducted 20 years ago. Having weighed this evidence with the seriousness it deserves, this court finds that substantial and compelling proof exists to suggest the original ruling was based on documents that were deliberately and fraudulently altered. A wave of tense murmurs swept through the courtroom, quickly silenced by a sharp glance from Justice Harmon. Therefore, he continued, this court formally overturns the ruling issued 20 years ago against Edmund Ashworth, now known as Edmund Hale, and orders the restoration of his family's original claim to the shipping venture's proceeds, along with appropriate compensation for damages resulting from the fraudulent ruling, to be determined in subsequent proceedings. Alina felt her father's hand grip hers tightly beneath the table, and when she glanced at him, she saw tears sliding freely down his weathered face, 20 years of quiet grief and patient waiting finally, fully released. Across the aisle, Lady Constance sat frozen, her carefully composed expression finally collapsing entirely as the full weight of the ruling settled over her. While beside her, Reginald rose slowly from his seat, his eyes meeting Alina's across the crowded courtroom with an expression that carried something far warmer than simple relief. Outside the courthouse, reporters and curious onlookers had gathered in considerable numbers, eager for any glimpse of the family whose story had captivated the entire county for weeks. Alina walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight beside her father, her heart still racing from everything that had just unfolded, and found herself searching the crowd instinctively for one particular face. Reginald stood near the edge of the courthouse steps, having separated himself from his mother's side entirely now, watching Alina with an expression that seemed to carry equal parts admiration and quiet uncertainty about what, exactly, came next between them. "Miss Whitmore," he said, approaching carefully through the dispersing crowd. "Or should I say, Miss Hale, now that your family's true name has been formally restored?" "Alina will do," she said, allowing a small, genuine smile to touch her lips for the first time in what felt like weeks. "After everything we have been through together these past weeks, I think formal titles have become somewhat unnecessary between us." Reginald's answering smile carried real warmth. "Alina, then. I know this is hardly the appropriate moment, given everything your family has just endured, but I find myself wanting to ask whether you might allow me the chance to properly make amends for the way I first treated you, in a setting rather different from a crowded courtroom." Alina studied him for a long moment, considering everything that had happened since that humiliating dinner weeks earlier. The fear and uncertainty, the careful investigation, the quiet courage her father had finally rediscovered after 20 years of hiding, and the unexpected, genuine transformation she had witnessed in the man standing before her now. "Perhaps," she said finally, "once the dust from all of this has properly settled, I might consider extending an invitation of my own. Though I promise you, Lord Ashford, whatever table you find yourself seated at next, you will not be called plain." Reginald laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound Alina had never heard from him before, warm and entirely without the careless cruelty that had defined their very first meeting. "I would expect nothing less, Alina. I look forward to it, whenever that day arrives." Behind them, Edmund Hale watched the exchange with quiet, thoughtful interest, his weathered face carrying an expression somewhere between cautious hope and lingering wariness, the careful instincts of a man who had learned, 20 years earlier, exactly how quickly fortune could turn against those who trusted too easily. But for now, standing on the courthouse steps in the warm afternoon sunlight, surrounded by a crowd still buzzing with the news of the ruling that had just restored his family's name after 2 decades of quiet suffering, he allowed himself, for the first time in a very long while, to simply feel grateful for the daughter who had walked into a dinner party 3 weeks earlier as a quiet, unassuming guest, and walked out again as the woman who would finally, fully reclaim everything that had once been stolen from their family. The road ahead remained uncertain in many ways, compensation still to be determined, a fractured relationship between Reginald and his mother still to be mended or permanently severed, an entire county's opinion of both families still shifting and reshaping itself with each passing day. But for the first time in 20 years, Edmund Hale walked away from a courthouse with his head held high, his daughter beside him, and the truth, at long last, fully and finally acknowledged. 6 months passed before Alina felt ready to host a dinner of her own, and when the invitations finally went out, written in her own careful hand rather than dictated to a secretary, they caused nearly as much stir throughout the county as the original scandal had caused the previous autumn. The old Ashworth house had been restored during those 6 months, its cellar cleared of decades of forgotten clutter, its walls freshly painted, its gardens carefully tended once again after years of neglect. The compensation awarded through the court's final ruling had proven more than sufficient to return the property to something resembling its former grandeur, and Alina had thrown herself into the restoration with the same quiet, determined energy she had once brought to searching for the truth about her family's past. Her father had wept again the day they moved into the house together, walking slowly through rooms he remembered only faintly from early childhood, before his own father's ruin had scattered their family into obscurity. He moved through the halls now with a lightness Alina had never seen in him before, humming softly to himself as he arranged old family portraits that had been recovered from storage, finally restored to their rightful places along the walls. Alina stood now in the newly restored dining hall, watching carefully as the final preparations for the evening's dinner were completed. Candles lit along the long table, fresh flowers arranged in careful bouquets, the good silver polished to a bright shine by the small household staff she had recently hired, several of whom had once served the Ashford family themselves before choosing, quietly, to seek employment elsewhere following the scandal that had rocked the county. Agnes stood near the doorway, having accepted Alina's offer of a permanent position within the newly restored household, her weathered face carrying a quiet, contented pride as she watched the final preparations come together. "You look nervous," Agnes observed, moving closer as Alina straightened a place setting for what felt like the third time. "I am nervous," Alina admitted, allowing herself a small, rueful smile. "It has been 6 months since I last hosted anything more formal than tea with Margaret, and tonight's guest list carries rather more weight than a simple gathering of friends." "He will not disappoint you," Agnes said knowingly. "I have watched that young man closely these past months, Alina. Whatever cruelty he once carried at his family's table, he has spent every day since working to leave it behind entirely." Alina's smile widened slightly at the mention of Reginald. In the months since the trial's conclusion, he had visited frequently, first to help oversee the property's restoration, then simply because their conversations had grown into something neither of them seemed eager to end. His relationship with his mother remained strained, though not entirely broken, the two of them slowly rebuilding something new from the wreckage of the scandal that had exposed decades of carefully hidden family secrets. Lady Constance herself had retreated largely from public society in the months following the trial, her reputation significantly diminished though not entirely destroyed, her remaining fortune considerably smaller after the court-ordered compensation had been paid in full. Alina had heard, through careful, indirect channels, that she had begun spending considerable time at a smaller family property in the countryside, far from the social circles that had once celebrated her family's wealth and standing. Charlotte Vane, meanwhile, had found her own social standing significantly damaged by her exposed role in Lady Constance's attempted surveillance, and had eventually left the county entirely, moving to live with distant relatives in a city far removed from the scandal she had played her own small, unfortunate part in creating. The first guests began arriving just as the sun began to set, carriages rolling up the newly repaired drive, well-dressed men and women stepping out into the golden evening light, eager to see for themselves the restored splendor of the house that had once belonged to a family everyone believed destroyed forever. Alina greeted each guest personally at the door, her composure steady and gracious, carrying none of the nervous uncertainty that had once made her practice a polite smile in her small bedroom mirror before attending Lord Ashford's dinner nearly a year earlier. She had grown, in the months since that humiliating evening, into a woman entirely comfortable within her own skin, confident in her name, her history, and her place within a society that had once dismissed her as nothing more than a plain, unremarkable guest. Reginald arrived among the later carriages, stepping down alone, his expression carrying a mixture of genuine excitement and something that looked almost like nervousness as he approached the newly restored front steps. "You look remarkable," he said quietly once he reached her, his eyes taking in the elegant dress she wore, a deep green gown that suited her far better than the simple blue dress she had worn to his own dinner all those months earlier. "Thank you," Alina said, allowing herself a small, warm smile. "Shall we go inside? I believe dinner is nearly ready." The meal itself passed pleasantly, filled with careful conversation and genuine laughter, a stark contrast to the tense, cruel atmosphere that had defined Alina's first dinner within Ashford's social circles. She watched throughout the evening as her father moved comfortably among the guests, sharing careful, measured stories about his family's history, no longer hiding behind a false name, no longer burying 2 decades of quiet grief beneath careful silence. It was only near the meal's conclusion, as the final course was cleared away, and the candles had burned down considerably lower than when the evening began, that Alina rose from her seat at the head of the table, tapping gently against her glass to draw the room's attention. The table fell silent, every guest turning toward her with curious anticipation, and Alina felt, for just a moment, an echo of the same tension she had experienced nearly a year earlier, standing at Lord Ashford's own table while he humiliated her in front of 30 strangers. But this time the silence carried none of that old fear. This time, she stood tall and composed, entirely certain of her place within the room. "Many of you know the story of what happened at Lord Ashford's dinner table nearly a year ago," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "Some of you were present for it yourselves. I was called plain that evening, dismissed as nothing more than an amusing distraction for a room full of powerful strangers who believed my quiet manner and simple dress meant I carried no history worth respecting." A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, though Alina continued without hesitation, her voice steady and clear. "I have thought often, in the months since that evening, about what it truly means to be dismissed so easily, to be judged entirely by the surface someone chooses to see rather than the history and character that lies beneath it. And I have come to understand that the very cruelty meant to diminish me that evening became, instead, the exact moment that finally set my family free from 20 years of quiet hiding." She glanced briefly at her father, who watched her with unmistakable pride, before continuing. "Tonight, I welcome you into a home that was stolen from my family through fraud and cruelty 2 decades ago, now finally restored through truth and patient perseverance. I do not share this story tonight seeking sympathy, or even apology, though I have received both in generous measure over these past months. I share it because I believe it carries a lesson worth remembering, that quiet dignity, however easily mocked or dismissed in a single unguarded moment, often carries a strength that far outlasts whatever cruelty seeks to diminish it." She lifted her glass, and around the table, guests slowly followed her example, raising their own glasses in quiet, respectful acknowledgement. "To truth," Alina said simply, "and to the patience required to finally bring it into the light." "To truth," the table echoed, and Alina felt, for the first time since that humiliating evening nearly a year earlier, that the story her father had spent 20 years afraid to tell had finally reached its proper, dignified conclusion. Later that evening, once most of the guests had departed, and only a handful of close friends remained, gathered comfortably in the newly restored drawing room, Reginald found a quiet moment to draw Alina aside, leading her out onto the terrace overlooking the freshly restored gardens below. "You spoke beautifully tonight," he said quietly, once they stood alone beneath the star-filled sky. "Though I confess, listening to you describe that dinner again, I found myself wishing more than ever that I could undo the cruelty of that evening entirely." "You cannot undo it," Alina said gently, "and I have come to believe, strangely enough, that I would not wish to, even if such a thing were possible." That single cruel remark set into motion everything that followed, the truth about my family, the restoration of everything that was stolen from us, and this house standing behind us now, fully returned to where it always belonged. "And us?" Reginald asked quietly, his eyes searching her face carefully in the soft evening light. "Did that evening set something into motion between us as well, or am I simply imagining a connection that exists only within my own hopeful mind?" Alina studied him for a long, quiet moment, considering everything they had endured together across the past year, the careful trust slowly built between two families whose history had once seemed destined only for bitter conflict. "I do not believe you are imagining it," she said finally, allowing a warm smile to touch her lips. "Though I will admit, it took considerable time and effort on your part to earn the trust you now hold, Reginald Ashford." "I would earn it 1,000 times over," he said quietly, "if it meant standing here with you tonight in this garden beneath the stars, exactly as we are now." Alina laughed softly, the sound carrying warmly across the quiet terrace. "Careful, my lord. Such flattering words, spoken so earnestly, might convince a woman that you have grown into someone entirely different from the arrogant man who once called her plain at his own table." "I have grown into someone entirely different," Reginald said simply, his expression carrying complete sincerity. "Because of you, Alina. Because you refused to let that cruelty define you, and in refusing, you taught me exactly how much I needed to change." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, watching the stars settle more firmly into the darkening sky above the restored gardens, two people whose families had once been bound together by betrayal and ruin, now standing together at the beginning of something entirely new, built not on cruelty or careless assumption, but on hard-won truth, patient courage, and the quiet, steady dignity that Alina had carried with her, unwavering. Since the very moment she rose from her seat at that first humiliating dinner and offered the world a curtsy, no one in that room would ever forget. A full year passed before the county witnessed another gathering at the restored Ashworth house, though this time the occasion carried none of the careful tension that had marked Alina's first dinner as mistress of her reclaimed home. Instead, the wide lawns beyond the garden had been transformed with rows of white chairs and delicate arrangements of late summer flowers, and the entire household staff moved through the grounds with quiet, joyful purpose, preparing for a wedding that half the county had been anticipating since word first spread of Reginald Ashford's quiet, persistent courtship of the woman he had once so carelessly insulted. Edmund Hale stood near the garden's entrance that afternoon, dressed in a fine new coat that still felt slightly unfamiliar against his shoulders after so many years of modest, careful living. He watched the preparations with quiet wonder, still occasionally overwhelmed by how completely his family's fortune had reversed itself in the 2 years since that fateful dinner invitation had first arrived at their small apartment above the bakery. He thought often, during quiet moments like this one, about the many years he had spent hiding, convinced that silence and obscurity offered the safest path forward for his daughter. He understood now, watching Alina move confidently through the gardens in her wedding preparations, laughing warmly with Margaret and Agnes as they made final adjustments to her gown, that he had been wrong to believe safety required hiding at all. His daughter had never needed protection from the truth of her own history. She had needed only the chance to stand within it, fully and openly, and claim whatever strength that history offered her. Lady Constance arrived early that afternoon, dressed simply, without the elaborate finery she had once favored during her years of unquestioned social prominence. The past 2 years had changed her considerably, softening some of the sharp, calculating edges that had once defined her every interaction, though traces of her old formidable nature remained clearly visible whenever she spoke. She found Alina alone for a brief moment near the edge of the garden, and the two women regarded each other carefully, their relationship still cautious after everything that had passed between their families. "You look lovely," Lady Constance said finally, her voice carrying genuine, if somewhat reserved, warmth. "I confess, when my son first insisted on pursuing this connection, I believed it would end in nothing but further disaster for this family. I am pleased to admit quite thoroughly that I was mistaken." "Thank you," Alina said carefully, though she offered Lady Constance a small, genuine smile. "I know these past 2 years have not been easy for you, watching your family's fortune and reputation change so dramatically." "They have not," Lady Constance admitted. "But I have come to believe, slowly and reluctantly, that the change was necessary and perhaps long overdue. My son has become a better man these past 2 years than I ever expected him to become, and I understand now that much of that transformation began the evening he insulted you so carelessly at our table." "A strange beginning for such a happy occasion," Alina observed. "Perhaps the strangest beginnings often lead toward the most meaningful endings," Lady Constance said thoughtfully, and for a moment something in her expression softened into what almost resembled genuine affection. "I wish you every happiness, Alina, truly." The ceremony itself passed in a warm, golden blur of afternoon sunlight and quiet joy, Alina walking down the garden aisle on her father's arm, past rows of guests who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a plain, unremarkable stranger, now watching her with unmistakable admiration and respect. Reginald waited for her beneath a simple arch of white flowers, his expression carrying none of the arrogant confidence that had once defined him, replaced instead by something far more genuine, a quiet, overwhelming happiness that needed no theatrical display to prove its sincerity. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken quietly enough that only those closest to the ceremony could hear every word, though the meaning behind them carried clearly across the entire gathered assembly. Alina spoke of truth, of patience, of the quiet strength required to reclaim what cruelty had once tried to steal away. Reginald spoke of transformation, of humility learned through genuine remorse, of gratitude for a woman whose grace and dignity had taught him more about true character than 30 years of privileged upbringing ever had. When the ceremony concluded and the celebration moved into the evening hours, filled with music and laughter, and the warm glow of countless candles scattered throughout the restored gardens, Alina found herself standing once again beside her father, watching the joyful gathering with quiet, contented satisfaction. "Your grandfather would be proud," Edmund said softly, watching Alina's new husband move through the crowd, greeting guests with genuine warmth rather than the careless arrogance he had once carried so easily. He always believed that truth, however long delayed, eventually finds its way into the light. "He was right," Alina said, resting her head briefly against her father's shoulder, the same way she had done as a small child listening to his careful, patient stories about grace and timing, and the exact moment when a quiet person finally decides to speak. "Though I confess, Father, I never expected the light to arrive quite so dramatically or from quite such an unexpected direction." Edmund Hale laughed softly, a warm, genuine sound that carried none of the careful guardedness he had once needed to protect their small, hidden life above the bakery. "Life rarely announces its most important moments in advance, Alina. It simply presents them, sometimes cruelly, sometimes cleverly disguised, and leaves us to decide for ourselves whether we possess the courage to meet them fully." Alina smiled, watching her husband turn from across the crowded garden, his eyes finding hers immediately. The same warm, genuine expression he had carried since that quiet evening on the terrace when he had first admitted, with complete sincerity, exactly how much she had changed him. The story that had begun with a single, cruel remark at a crowded dinner table had traveled a long and difficult road since that humiliating evening, through fear and careful investigation, through courtroom battles and fractured family loyalties, through the slow, patient rebuilding of trust between two families whose history had once seemed destined only for bitter conflict. But it had arrived, finally, at exactly the kind of quiet, dignified conclusion that Alina's father had always promised her patience and grace would eventually earn. She stood now not as a plain, forgotten guest dismissed at the edge of someone else's table, but as the mistress of her own restored home, surrounded by a family finally free of the shame and hiding that had defined so much of her early life, and a husband who understood, more completely than most men ever would, exactly how much strength true dignity could carry, even in its quietest, most unassuming form. As the evening deepened, and the garden lanterns cast their warm, golden light across the gathered celebration, Alina allowed herself at last to simply feel grateful for the courage her father had quietly instilled in her across so many careful years, for the strength that had carried her through that first humiliating dinner and every difficult moment that followed, and for the unexpected, hard-won happiness that now surrounded her completely, in a home and a life that had once seemed lost forever. Finally and fully reclaimed,